All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Bible class this morning. We'll continue with our study on creation versus evolution. Before we do that, though, prayer requests and people to keep in mind as we pray. Let's continue to pray for Brother Larry, who is continuing to be evaluated. He's going to see a neurosurgeon on the 27th to see what they say about his pituitary. So let's continue to pray for him and his doctors and his care team, that they will be able to come up with the best plan and implement it, and that it'll be successful in healing all the problems. Continue to pray for those who are battling cancer. So Brother David, Sister Helen, Brother Stan. There'll be several people that are traveling that time of year as well. So let's pray for safe travels. Anything else to add to our prayer list? Okay. So I'll go ahead and lead us in prayer, and then we'll continue with our study for today. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you again for being who you are, for being our God, for being the creator, the one who rules all things, the most powerful, and thank you for allowing us to be your children, for adopting us to be heirs along with your Son of all things that you've created, for making a home for us, an eternal home for us that we'll be able to go to and live forever with you if we remain faithful to you until the end. Lord, thank you for waking us up this morning, for giving us the health and the strength to get here and make it today and to study your word. I pray that you'll be with us and be with our minds and help us to understand these things as you would have us to understand it. I pray for Brother Larry, Father, and his doctors and his care team, that you will help them to come up with the best solution, the best plan, and implement it with the skill that you've given them, and that you'll provide healing. I pray for those others that are sick, others that are hurting in different ways, whether it's spiritually or mentally or emotionally or physically or financially. You know everyone's issues, Father. You know what's going on, even if no one says. I pray that you'll be with us and help us all. Please guide us today as we go through the study and as we do the rest of our church service, and that our minds will be open and receptive to your word, and that we will be able to focus on what you will have us to learn, and that we'll learn what you want us to learn. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. All right. So, continuing on with what we've been going on, we've been learning about fossils and kind of geologic time and the geological scale, geologic record. So, geology, as applies to the creation versus evolution debate, I guess you could say. I want to thank Brother Allen for filling in for me for the last couple of lessons, and we're going to pick up essentially where we left off last time. There's a couple of concepts that I want to review to keep in mind. We'll be watching a video today, but there's a couple of concepts to keep in mind as we watch, because they're very important for this topic. The first concept, and we've talked about these before, but uniformitarianism, again, is the idea that Earth has always changed in uniform ways and that the present is the key to the past. So if you look at this picture right here, you see here's the Grand Canyon, there's the Colorado River that's going through the canyon. And so in the uniformitarianism, I guess, mindset or a way of thinking of the Earth, you could measure how much that river erodes the Grand Canyon every year. So you could say, and I'm just making numbers up, but the river erodes the Grand Canyon away at 1 millimeter per year. And then you could look and see how far the river is from the top of the canyon, and you say, well, that's 100 meters from the river to the top of the canyon. And so at 1 millimeter per year, that means that there's been 100 million years that the river has been going through the Grand Canyon. So that's uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. Same thing is true. You see all these rock layers right here, sedimentary rock. So you could say, you could measure and get an estimate of the sediment, the rate that sediment is laid down today. Let's say, again, I'm making up numbers because I don't know what it is, but let's say that sediment is laid down at 1 millimeter per year. And then you look and say, well, there's hundreds, there's 100 meters of sediment there, so therefore it's taken 100 million years for this sediment to be laid down or deposited. Okay, so that's the uniformitarianism mindset, and that's kind of the guiding principle for geology as far as science goes today. And so that's going to be important. You'll hear that term as we watch this video. But just keep that in mind. The present is the key to the past. Is the mindset as far as uniformitarianism goes. But the problem with that is that it can't account for any type of catastrophes, essentially. And then geologic time. We've been talking about this as well. So this is basically the calendar, scientific calendar of the Earth and the Earth's past. And so the main things that you hear about are the eras and the periods. And so we, again, the Mesozoic Era is called the era of the dinosaurs. You have the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic. But you keep going down, and you get down here to the periods, the Cambrian, and then before the Cambrian, everything else is Pre-Cambrian. We've been talking about that. We'll continue to talk about it. In this video, you'll be able to see what Pre-Cambrian rock actually looks like. Remember, in the Pre-Cambrian, Cambrian, there's not much that's found. Fossil succession is the generalized order of fossils that come up when you go down the fossil record. And so you can see over here these different organisms, and they're represented by these different time periods, essentially. And this time is counted in millions of years and hundreds of millions of years, back to billions of years when you get past the Cambrian time period. And then this is the general order that you find fossils worldwide. So if you start down at the bottom, down in the Cambrian, at the bottom of the fossil record, you find a lot of marine animals, shelled creatures from marine environments, and then just above that you find fish, and then you go higher up in the fossil level and you get to the amphibians, and then you get to reptiles, and then you get to mammals, birds, and then humans at the top of the fossil record. And so that is the general order that you see fossils that occur worldwide distribution of fossils that kind of occur in that order. But as we've seen, evolutionists' predictions would be that it would be an absolute order, because you can't have something that appears before it evolved. And we've been seeing that it is not an absolute order, which is what you would expect if there was a global flood catastrophe. I mentioned this a long time ago at the very beginning, but keep this in mind again as we watch this video. So facts, I asked the question, which do you think there's more facts for, scientific facts for creation versus or evolution? And the answers vary depending on who you ask that question to. But in reality, the facts are the same. They're the same facts. So the facts that the creationists use will be the same facts that the evolutionists use. There are only so many. There are only so many facts, things that are proven. Okay, so the fossils, where they are, the rock layers, those are facts. But the way that the facts are interpreted depends upon depends upon the worldview. So an evolutionist could look at the rock layers in the Grand Canyon and say, wow, this is great evidence for evolution, whereas a creationist could look at the rock layers in the Grand Canyon and say, wow, this is great evidence for creation. It just depends upon the worldview and the starting assumptions. So one starting assumption would be that there is or is not a God, but that the whole uniformitarianism principle is that the present is the key to the past, and using a naturalistic way, so meaning without any type of divine intervention, everything just naturally occurred on its own. That would be one worldview, and the other worldview would be that there is a God who created, and that there is, and we can use that to see and understand the things that are around us. Okay, so again, the evidence, you'll see the same evidence, but again, we're talking about historical science, things that no one was there to see. And so what that means is that you have evidence, and then you have to build a story around that evidence, the story that you think best fits the picture that you see from that evidence. And so there's man's story, and then there's God's story. And so for us, we will start with God's story in the Bible. We believe the Bible is the Word of God. And so we start with that story and use that to explain what we see, whereas science and human beings have used their wisdom to come up with a different story. And so with that, I'm going to show the video. You started it, those of you who were here on Wednesday, you all started this video. But we only got to the first question. There are some questions in here, so I'll let them talk, and then when we get to a question, I'll stop and explain it. If anyone was not here to get the handout, I think there's some more copies up front. So if you need one, then raise your hand and we can get you a copy from up front. Okay. Brother Gene, can you put the lights for us back there, please? Thank you. Hang on 1 second. I plug in. There we go.
Could a worldwide catastrophe occur and not leave behind some evidence that it actually happened? Global flood is more than just a story written in a book. It's written in the earth itself. And these physical evidences remain as a witness and a warning to us. So now let's take some time to investigate the judgment. One of the most unique and beautiful features of the Grand Canyon are the various different colored sedimentary layers that run along the canyon walls for miles. These layers are made up of sandstone and limestone, and that's what creates that rainbow in the rocks. It's one of the things that makes the Grand Canyon so awesome to look at. But not only are these layers unique to the Grand Canyon, they give us our greatest clue on how the canyon was formed.
Rock layers that we see everywhere on the Earth are generally in layers. the sedimentary rocks are almost all deposited by water.
We see the rock layers consist of turbidites, washed in material, and with the catastrophism that was going on, you would have turbiditic action and the washing in of material.
So water brings mud or sand or even coarser materials, carries it and deposits it in a layer. That's typically how the rocks in the geologic column form. And then there are different kinds of sediments, so they end up making rocks that look very different, right on top of each other. But there's the question of this one layer formed, and then how much time passed until the next layer came on top of it.
The commonly held belief is that over millions of years, an ocean advanced over the entire continent and deposited a sedimentary layer, and then retreated, leaving the ground dry once again. In this dry period, lasting tens of millions of years, this sediment would have been exposed to weathering and erosion.
And if it just sits there without being covered up fairly quickly, then a lot of things happen. Plants grow on it, roots go down through it, animals burrow through it, flowing water will carve channels and gullies through it. And so it doesn't just stay undisturbed.
Tens of millions of years of weathering and erosion would create an enormous amount of uneven terrain between these two layers, such as hills and valleys, but this is not what we see. There's little variation between these layers. They're extremely flat.
And these time spans that supposedly occurred between two layers can be 10 million years, it can be 15 million, they can be up to 150 million years, like you see at one place in the Grand Canyon, in deposits in the Grand Canyon.
You'd expect a lot of erosion then. In fact, so much erosion that the whole record should be gone a long time ago. Average rates of erosion are about 61 millimeters per 1,000 years.
With the same rate of erosion of 61 millimeters per 1,000 years, we should not be looking for 300 feet of erosion, not 3,000 feet of erosion, but 30,020 feet of erosion over a period of 150 million years. All the sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon combined should have eroded 6 times over, and yet these layers are flat, telling us that these layers were deposited rapidly in quick succession.
So is it realistic to think that 150 million years passed and nothing happened to this layer? It was not eroded out into serious gullies? And it looks much more likely that there wasn't that time in between those different layers.
The weather is always changing, and the surface of the Earth is always changing with it. Thunderstorms, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and wind, among other factors, are always changing and sculpturing the surface of our planet. These elements are always depositing sediment or eroding sediment, resulting in irregular surfaces. If you have time, then you're going to have change. So when we look at the contact points between these layers of sediment and see no evidence of erosion and no evidence of deposition, this idea that millions of years went by and nothing happened to the surface, it just doesn't add up.
These are turbidite layers, often graded coarse to fine, which defies uniformitarian principles. It had to be rapid deposition.
When you have a gap of 100 million years, you have a couple miles of erosion. Yet you look at the gap and it's flat. If it had taken a lot of time, you should have irregular erosion at the gaps.
So
Okay, so we'll get to this first question, and these are things as we watch this video, just really common sense stuff that no one thinks about and no one talks about, and you won't see in any textbooks or anything, but a different way of looking at the things that we see. So the question is, what does the flatness between the sedimentary layers of the Grand Canyon tell us? And then how is that evidence of the Genesis flood account? So what is the flatness? You made a point talking about how those layers, the lines between each layer of sedimentary rock, how they're basically completely flat. What does that tell us? What's the significance of that? Yeah, sure. Right. Frozen in time, exactly. Yeah, there's no erosion. So remember that those rocks are supposed to represent time. and lots of time, so millions of years, hundreds, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, in which between each of those layers, that was supposed to be how much time has occurred between those layers. But we know that with time comes change, and there's going to be some erosion, and there's going to be things that are going to change the surface if there's that time that's there. But what we see is that those layers, all those layers are flat, straight flat across, meaning that there wasn't any time for any erosion or deposition, other deposition to occur, because it's a flat surface. It's a straight line that goes straight through there. Okay, all right. So why is that a problem, I guess, for the evolutionary story that we're told, that these rock layers take millions of years to form, hundreds of millions? Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So if it were true that it took hundreds of millions of years for these to form, then the lines would not be flat. There would be zigzags. There would be it would not be a flat and even surface as far as the deposition goes. And then they also mentioned about the rate of erosion being 61 millimeters per 1,000 years, and how much, if that amount of time had occurred, how much erosion would have taken place. The entire Grand Canyon would have been eroded away if it had taken that long for those rock layers to form. Okay, so we'll continue on, and then we'll stop again when we get to the next question.
Erosional feature is saying, oh, hey, short time, not long time.
The flatness of the layers and so on tells you about a past that's entirely different. And this is the kind of data that you'd expect from the Genesis flood.
Millions of years worth of erosion is missing because it was never there. This is what the rocks are telling us. But erosion is not the only thing missing. In fact, entire layers of sediment representing tens of millions of years are also missing. Here in the Grand Canyon, you can see right behind me this light-colored rock. That's coconino sandstone. It's sandwiched right on top of this darker color here. It's called hermit shale. There's a layer of sediment missing between the coconino sandstone and the hermit shale called the Schnebly Hill Formation. Here we can see the lighter colored coconino sandstone, and sitting beneath that is the Schnebly Hill Formation that was missing from the Grand Canyon. Beneath the Schnebly Hill Formation is the hermit shale, though somewhat obscured by the vegetation in the valley. This is the Schnebly Hill Formation. It's more than 800 feet of rock, which is said to represent about 6 million years.
And the problem that science has is that it cannot just remove that rock layer, because in the mind of the modern geologist, each rock layer is associated with time. So removing a rock layer means you've removed a block of time. So the solution to them would be, well, the bottom layers formed, the missing ones must have been there because the time was there, but here in this area there must have been a period of erosion that took them away to the previous layer, thus not leaving a trace, and then the next one was deposited on top. The problem with that is that the contact is absolutely flat, like one glass sheet on top of another one, leaving no evidence of those erosional features which would show deep leaching, washout, any one of those scenarios. They're not there.
Why are they a challenge to the long geologic ages? Because there is no erosion there.
Okay, so here's the next question. So if you remember, the title of the lesson today was Missing. And so we're starting to see why I titled the lesson that missing. So we see that there's entire rock layers that are missing out of the Grand Canyon. So there's formations that should be sitting on top of another rock layer, but they're not there. And so what is the response, the evolutionary response to these missing layers of rock, which equates to missing time? He just explained what their explanation would be, and then why that doesn't work as well. So what is the explanation that the evolutionists would propose as far as why those rocks are missing that should be there? You have your hand up. Right, exactly, yeah. So the explanation would be that those rocks were there, they had to be there because the time, those rocks represent time, but then those rocks completely eroded away, and then the new rock layer came and filled in on top of that. Again, the problem though is that the surface is completely flat. There's a flat contact between the previous rock layer and then the rock layer that filled in the missing rocks, the rocks that are gone. And so it doesn't, that explanation doesn't hold weight, again, because of the flat contacts. There's missing erosion. There's no erosion there that you would expect to see. And then especially for just one section of the missing rock to erode completely down without a trace, and then it's a completely flat contact between the upper layer and the lower layer, where the missing rock is not there. And so, as we see that there are things that are missing that really make holes in the story, or the storytelling that we get, as far as being missing erosion, there's missing sediments. Really, there's missing time, since rocks represent time and that uniformitarianism mindset. Okay, so we'll continue on. Stop again, we'll get to the next one.
The Schnebly Hill Formation is missing from between these two layers, and there's no evidence of any erosion. This tells us that there was little or no time between the formation of these layers, and that they were deposited rapidly in a catastrophic event. This is why the Schnebly Hill Formation is missing in between these layers in the Grand Canyon, and is seen yet in another location only 90 miles away.
So the Grand Canyon is a beautiful geological example of catastrophism, and defies modern theories as to how these unconformities came about.
Here is the red wall limestone sitting on top of the mauve limestone. Between these two layers, we should see the Temple Butte Formation, representing up to 155 million years of time. Instead, it's completely missing. There's no evidence of the 5.8 miles of erosion we would expect to see over this period of time.
There's no evidence of erosion, no evidence of deposition, just a flat contact. But you can't have an area of 30 or 40, 50,000 square kilometers that have a flat surface that sits there for 100 million years. 100 million years, after all, is enough time to erode North America down from its current elevation to base level to sea level 6-7 times.
And here the contact between the red wall limestone and the mauve limestone is flat, telling us that there was little or no passage of time between their formation. The 150 million years missing from between these two layers does not conform to the geological column. And for this reason, a sign has been placed here by the Park Service, marking it as yet another unconformity. We've looked at just a few of these unconformities, and in each instance there was no erosion or deposition taking place in the supposed periods of millions of years. These are serious problems for evolutionists, but they pale in comparison to what is called the Great Unconformity, a gap of over 1 billion years of missing time. And guess what? The contact between these two layers is flat, just like the others.
It is interesting as we go down to the level of the Colorado River, we find what we call the Pre-Cambrian. The volcanic material sits there, and it's pretty rough and pretty jumbled. And then the Cambrian sediments that come in over that lay over that, and then now they become very non-jumbled layer after layer.
I became keenly aware of that great unconformity that lies between the Precambrian and the Cambrian there in the Grand Canyon. You can't miss it. It's with you all the time.
The Great Unconformity in the Grand Canyon represents 1.2 billion years of time that is missing between the Precambrian and the Cambrian layers. Over this amount of time, we should see up to 45 miles of uneven erosion. That's nearly enough erosion to erode away the entire 25 miles of the Earth's crust twice. Yet the Cambrian sits flat on top of the Precambrian layer. And once again, the contact point between these two layers is horizontal, telling us that the deposition of these layers is not the work of 1.2 billion years of erosion, but empirical evidence for a widespread water-based catastrophe that occurred rapidly in a short period of time.
Then you come to the Cambrian layer, and all of a sudden things change dramatically. Most of your animal phyla appear all of a sudden in that Cambrian layer.
Not only isolated species, but whole phyla appear suddenly. Now that's mind-boggling. If you take a phylum, and that's a huge category of creatures. A phylum Mollusca, for example, is every single snail and slug down to squids and octopi and all the creatures that belong to this group. And they all appeared simultaneously at the same time. That doesn't leave much room for slow evolutionary processes.
This is a double problem for evolution here that we have, and evolutionists are aware of this, and they call this the Cambrian Explosion.
The Cambrian Explosion is the period referred to in the Cambrian layers where animals appear fully formed in the fossil record. These fully formed fossils consist of the data we observe. Since the Precambrian layer does not contain fossils of animal phyla or intermediary species, this leaves the concept of origins from interconnected evolutionary steps ever to exist in the realm of theory.
Okay. So there's kind of a lot in that section of the video. Before we get to the question, I just want to make a point again about everything that's missing. We said that these rock layers represent time, and so there's an awful lot of time that's missing in the Grand Canyon. There's examples of 150 million years of rock that's not there. There's the Great Unconformity, like 1 billion years of rock that is not there. You can see the Cambrian rock in those videos that they were showing. And then when you see the sedimentary rock on top of it, so the layers, then that's when you get to the Cambrian and further up. But the Precambrian rock is the volcanic looking rock that kind of had the jagged squiggles that went through it. But all that's missing, so we see that there's missing erosion because in that amount of time, the entire Earth's crust would have eroded 6 times over. So not just the Grand Canyon, but the entire Earth itself would have eroded away. There's missing sediment. There's rocks that are missing that represent time, and so there's also missing time. And so it's very significant, important to understand that this really, it blows the story out of the water as far as the evolutionary tale of how things evolved and the amount of time that it took for the layers to form and things like that. Because there's no evidence that time ever existed, because we don't see any of the erosion. There's time missing and things like that. But it is strong evidence that those rock layers, all of them, were deposited very quickly. Like we've been learning about how fossils form quickly. Those rock layers had to be deposited very, very quickly on top of each other because there's no erosion in between. All right, so, and then we get to the Cambrian Explosion. Okay, so again, that Pre-Cambrian rock, that was the volcanic looking rock where you see the jagged lines that are going through. And then when you get above that, you get to the Cambrian where you start seeing the sedimentary rock with the layers. And so what the video mentioned, what it pointed out was that when you get to the Cambrian rock, all of a sudden you see all of these organisms occur. They appear out of nowhere. So not just simple isolated organisms, but as he was making the point, entire phyla of organisms. So what a phyla is, it's basically a body type, and then it's all the organisms, the types of organisms that fit within that specific body type. And so he made an example and he showed lots of different organisms for just one phyla. But all of these just appear out of nowhere in this Cambrian layer of rock. It's called the Cambrian Explosion. But why? The question is, why does that describe the Cambrian Explosion, explain why it presents a problem for evolution? So I've already kind of explained again what that was. But why is this problematic for the evolutionary story of everything evolving from a single cellular organism and then life evolving from there, becoming more complex? What do you think? Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. So the time is very significant for evolution. You have to have long periods of time in order to claim that something, a single cellular organism, evolved into everything else that's ever existed on the Earth. And so that time is necessary, even though we see using this with the Grand Canyon at that time isn't there, that the erosion's not there, that would be there, that there's millions of years that are missing, and so on. Yes. Mm-hmm. So not many. So generally you'll find like microscopic single cellular organisms. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is called a Cambrian rock. Yes. And that's what we're finding in fossils. That's fully formed organisms. Yep. So not any type of semi-formed organism, fully formed organisms. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so good question. Does that prove creation as far as when things were created? The video, we'll get to that. We're running out of time anyways. But so the problem for evolution with this is that you have to start off with a single cell organism, and then it has to evolve and keep changing to form something, whether it's a snail or some type of fish or whatever it is. But in the Pre-Cambrian, you don't find anything, and then when you get to the Cambrian, you find everything. It's just there. Okay, so The problem with that is that there's no evidence that anything ever evolved into these organisms. They just all of a sudden they appear on the scene and they're already there, fully formed, fully functional organisms. And so what is significant about that for us is that, so we believe that these rock layers were laid down during the flood. So the Pre-Cambrian rock, where you don't find organisms, typically don't find organisms, that would have been pre-flood layer. And so after or during the flood, as the flood occurs, and then organisms start getting buried, then you start to see these the fossils that are forming that show fully formed functional body types and organisms. Yeah. Right. Right. Yep. Yep. Yeah, good point. And so we'll get to that later on as well, as far as the order of burial, the general progression that we see as far as types of organisms. But I'll continue this. I think in this clip it'll talk a little bit more about what you were asking a second ago.
So what does that talk about? Is that about evolution? Hardly. It's about creation.
This Pre-Cambrian layer, often called the basement rock, only contains fossils of single-celled organisms and some soft-bodied creatures such as worms or jellyfish. This fits the biblical record because before the flood, there was no severe weather patterns or large catastrophes to bury and fossilize larger animals. The Cambrian layer, however, right above it, is the first sedimentary layer deposited by the flood. And this is why in it we see whole phyla of animals appearing suddenly and fully formed. There are no traces of intermediary species or slow evolutionary processes because no such things ever occurred. These sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon are not evidence for evolution. They are unbiased testimonies of a catastrophic flood. And when we look at the size of these deposits, they tell us that this catastrophic flood was a global event.
The Grand Canyon is there, and you can see the layers on the side of it, but all those layers go hundreds of miles up through Arizona and Utah and Wyoming and Montana and even into Canada, the same layers.
The Tapete sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon was the first layer deposited by the flood. It spans all the way from Mexico up across North America and even into Greenland. The Morrison Formation covers 400,000 square miles from New Mexico to Canada, and the St. Peter sandstone covered approximately 500,000 square miles.
When I thought about looking at those layers the way they are, they're all flat. There are no cuts between them. Not only are the layers themselves laid down rapidly, but there's not millions of years between them for erosion.
The lack of erosion between the sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon shows they were deposited rapidly in a catastrophe. But the fact that these layers extend for hundreds of miles, spanning several states and even up into Canada, shows the scale of the catastrophe was much larger than anything the world has witnessed in modern times.
Okay, I'll stop it right there because we won't get time to finish this clip. We only got about a minute left before the bell. But I wanted to just point this out real quick. So sedimentary rock is laid down in sediments, laid down. So based on water distribution. And we look at this picture right here, and we see this brown right here, and it goes all the way from the U.S. through Canada, all the way up. We see that this single layer right here covers continents. It's distributed across continents. And it's going to be laid down with water. So that means that the same, whatever it was that laid that layer down, it had to cover at least that much of the earth, that much space. And so it's very significant, just the size, scope of these sedimentary layers that have been laid down. And And that just blows out of the water the claim of a local flood, that local floods over millions of years are what deposited the layers, the sedimentary layers that we see, because we see that the scope of this had to be enormous in order to cover this area that we see here. So we will on Wednesday, we'll pick up here. We'll start at that question 3 again, or right after that question 3, and we'll continue and we'll watch the rest of the video. But this is a lot of really common sense stuff, but stuff that you don't hear, you won't see in your textbooks or be taught in your geology classes. All right, we'll pick up next time.